Benjamin Fletcher was not sleeping. His eyes were closed, his breathing slow and rhythmic, his 73-year-old body slumped in the leather chair. To anyone watching, he looked like a tired old man drifting into an afternoon nap. But beneath those eyelids, Benjamin was fully awake. Sharp. Calculating. Waiting. This was a game he played often. He was one of the richest men in the country, billions in real estate, investments, and tech. He had everything except one thing: trust in people. Over the decades, everyone had betrayed him. His son forged signatures. Business partners stole ideas. Staff pilfered jewelry and cash. Benjamin had learned a bitter truth: given the chance, everyone steals. Especially the desperate. Especially the poor. Today, he would prove it again. Rain hammered the windows. Fire crackled in the hearth. On the side table next to his hand sat an envelope, unsealed and bulging with cash. $50 bills. $5,000, spilling out carelessly as if forgotten. His test subjects stood frozen in the corner, 8-year-old twins, sons of his new maid. Their mother's desperate whisper still hung in the air. "Don't touch anything, or we'll lose everything." Benjamin waited. Then one of them moved. Benjamin Fletcher sat motionless in his study, a room that screamed success from every corner. First edition Hemingways and Fitzgeralds lined mahogany shelves that stretched to the ceiling. An original Monet hung above the fireplace, its pastel colors catching the firelight. Crystal awards from business magazines cluttered the mantel. Entrepreneur of the Year, Top 50 Most Influential. Financial plaques commemorated deals worth hundreds of millions. The Persian rug beneath his Italian leather shoes had cost more than most people's houses. He had everything. And he felt nothing. Benjamin had learned the truth about money early in life, though it had taken decades to fully crystallize into his personal philosophy. Money doesn't corrupt people, it reveals them. It strips away the performance, the politeness, the pretense, and shows you what they really are. Desperate. Greedy. Fundamentally selfish. Every single one of them. 3 ex-wives had proven it. The first had married him when he was building his empire, then demanded half when she grew bored. The second had an affair with his accountant while spending his fortune on jewelry and vacations. The third hadn't even pretended to love him, she'd simply calculated his net worth and decided it was worth 5 years of her life. His children were no better. Daniel called twice a year, Christmas and when he needed money. His daughter Emma hadn't spoken to him in 4 years, not since he'd refused to invest in her boyfriend's revolutionary cryptocurrency scheme that collapsed 3 months later. They'd visit when he died, he was certain of that. They'd show up for the will reading with tears in their eyes and lawyers in their pockets. Then there was Marcus Chin, his former business partner and closest friend for 20 years. Marcus, who'd embezzled $7 million over 3 years. Marcus, who'd looked Benjamin in the eye every morning and asked about his health while systematically destroying him. The betrayal hadn't just cost money, it had cost Benjamin the last shred of faith he'd had in human connection. Even the staff. God, especially the staff. The butler who'd stolen a Rolex. The cook who'd pocketed cash from his wallet. The gardener who'd sold stories about him to tabloids. The housekeeper who'd walked out with silverware piece by piece until half the set was gone. Outside, the cold November afternoon had turned the sky a bruised gray. Rain streaked the windows. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, orange light dancing across the expensive Persian rug. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, measuring out seconds with mechanical precision. Everything was perfect. Everything was ready. The envelopes sat on the side table, cream-colored and bulging, 50 crisp $100 bills visible through the open flap. $5,000, positioned carelessly within arm's reach, looking every bit like an old man's forgetfulness. Benjamin settled deeper into his chair, letting his shoulders slump, his head tilt slightly to the side. He closed his eyes and began his performance, the slow, steady breathing of sleep, the occasional flutter of his eyelids, the complete stillness of a man who drifted away from consciousness. Beneath the performance, His mind was a steel trap, waiting to snap shut. 2 weeks earlier, Adele Newton had sat in this same study, perched on the edge of a different chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. Benjamin Fletcher had studied her resume with the expression of a man examining something distasteful. 34 years old. High school education. Previous experience: waitress, retail clerk, hotel housekeeper. References from employers who'd gone out of business or moved away. "Why should I hire you?" he'd asked, not looking up from the paper. Adele had rehearsed her answer 100 times, but when she opened her mouth, the truth spilled out instead. "Because I need this job more than I've ever needed anything in my life." It wasn't the polished response she'd planned. It was raw and desperate, and probably exactly the wrong thing to say. But Fletcher had looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his face had shifted. He'd offered her the position on the spot. Head maid. $48,000 a year. Benefits. Regular hours. Adele had wept right there in his study, mascara running down her cheeks, unable to stop herself. She'd been widowed for 2 years. David had been 36 when his heart simply stopped one Tuesday morning while he was brushing his teeth. No warning. No history of heart problems. Just alive one moment and gone the next, leaving Adele with twin 8-year-olds, a mortgage she couldn't afford, and medical bills from the ambulance that hadn't saved him. She'd worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat. Morning shift at a dry cleaner. Afternoon shift stocking shelves at a grocery store. Night shift waiting tables at a 24-hour diner, serving truckers and insomniacs while her boys slept at a neighbor's apartment. She saw Henry and Oliver for maybe 2 hours a day. She was drowning, and Fletcher's offer was a lifeline. The salary meant she could quit the diner. She could be home at night. She could see her children's faces and something other than exhausted glimpses between shifts. But she'd heard the stories about Benjamin Fletcher. He was exacting. Cold. Impossibly particular about how things should be done. He'd fired his previous maid for using the wrong polish on his silverware. He'd dismissed a chef for seasoning his eggs incorrectly. People who worked for him either lasted years in silent terror or weeks before being shown the door. Adele couldn't afford to be shown the door. This morning, when the school called to say the building was closed for emergency plumbing repairs, and Mrs. Chin next door wasn't answering her phone, and every backup plan crumbled to dust, Adele had no choice. She'd brought Henry and Oliver with her, dressed them in their cleanest clothes, and delivered a warning that made her sound like someone she didn't recognize. "Mr. Fletcher values silence and stillness above everything," she told them in the car, gripping the steering wheel until her hands ached. "If you wake him or disturb anything at all, we will be fired. Do you understand what that means?" Henry, always the more serious twin, had nodded immediately. Oliver had looked down at his yellow gloves, the ones he wore everywhere because they made him feel brave, and whispered, "It means no food. It means no home." Henry had added quietly, "It means no safety." Adele had finished, hating herself for putting this weight on children. "So you stay exactly where I put you. You don't move. You don't speak. You don't touch anything. Promise me." They promised. And now they stood frozen in Fletcher's study, 2 small boys in worn but clean clothes, understanding far too much about how quickly everything could disappear. Adele's hand trembled slightly as she pushed open the study door. Mr. Fletcher sat in his leather chair exactly as she'd expected, head tilted back against the cushion, mouth slightly open, chest rising and falling in the deep, steady rhythm of sleep. The firelight played across his weathered face, making him look almost peaceful. Almost harmless. She knew better. "Here," she whispered to the twins, pointing to a spot near the bookshelves in the far corner of the room. The hardwood floor there was partially covered by the edge of the Persian rug, at least offering some small comfort. "Sit right there. Don't move. Don't speak. I'll be back in 30 minutes. Henry and Oliver nodded in unison, their eyes wide and solemn. They walked on tiptoe to the designated corner, their footsteps barely audible, and lowered themselves to the floor with painful slowness. They clutched their backpacks to their chests like shields. Adele cast one last look at her sons, two small figures trying to make themselves invisible, then slipped out of the room. The door closed with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silence. The grandfather clock ticked. The fire crackled. Rain continued its assault on the windows. Fletcher, beneath his closed eyelids, began his internal countdown. He knew how this would unfold. He'd seen it before with children, with teenagers, with adults who should have known better. First would come the whispers, testing the boundaries, checking if he was really asleep. Then the giggles, that nervous laughter children made when they thought they were getting away with something. Then the inevitable gravitational pull toward the money. The curiosity would become unbearable. $5,000 was an abstract concept to most children, but the green paper itself was tangible, fascinating, forbidden. He'd caught a nephew stealing once. The boy had been 12, old enough to know better, and he'd taken $300 from Fletcher's wallet during a family dinner. When confronted, he'd cried and apologized, but Fletcher had seen the calculation in his eyes even through the tears. He'd caught a housekeeper's teenage daughter pocketing cash from his desk drawer. He'd caught a business associate's son attempting to steal a rare coin from his collection. Children were no different from adults. Just less practiced at deception. 1 minute passed. Then 2. The silence stretched, unbroken except for the ambient sounds of the room. Fletcher felt a flicker of surprise. Usually, the whispers started immediately. 3 minutes. 4. Still nothing. 5 minutes crawled by in absolute silence. Fletcher's muscles began to ache from holding his position so perfectly still. His breathing remained artificially steady, but internally, he was recalibrating. Perhaps these children were more patient than most. Perhaps they were waiting longer to ensure he was truly asleep. Then he heard it. Movement. The soft shuffle of small feet against hardwood. Footsteps approaching. Fletcher's pulse quickened despite himself. Here it comes, he thought. The proof he'd been waiting for. The confirmation that even children, especially children raised in poverty, taught by desperate parents, would steal when they thought no one was watching. He prepared himself, counting the footsteps, judging the distance. The steps were light, hesitant, but definitely moving closer to his chair. Closer to the envelope. Closer to the money. His fingers tensed almost imperceptibly. In 3 seconds, maybe 4, he would open his eyes and catch the little thief red-handed. He would see the guilt flash across the child's face. He would watch the hand pull back from the envelope. And he would be right. Again. Always right about human nature. The footsteps stopped. Right next to his chair. Fletcher's muscles coiled, ready to spring the trap. The footsteps had stopped right beside his chair. This was it. The moment of truth. In 2 seconds, he would feel small fingers reaching for the envelope. In 3 seconds, he would open his eyes and something light and damp settled across his chest. Fletcher's prepared speech died in his throat. That wasn't the sensation of someone grabbing money. That was fabric. Weight. Warmth. Through the bare slits of his eyelids he saw him. Henry, the twin in the red jacket, except he wasn't wearing the red jacket anymore. The boy held it in both hands, his thin arms trembling slightly as he carefully draped it across Fletcher's torso. The jacket was damp from the rain, worn at the elbows, with a small tear near the collar that had been mended with inexpert stitches. Henry's whisper was so quiet it was almost lost beneath the crackle of the fire. "You look cold, mister. Mommy says old people get sick easy when they're cold." Fletcher's heart stuttered. His carefully controlled breathing hitched for just a fraction of a second before he forced it back to steadiness. This wasn't the script. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Children didn't, people didn't. Henry's small hands adjusted the coat with surprising gentleness, pulling it higher to cover Fletcher's shoulders. The boy's fingers brushed against Fletcher's suit jacket, feather-light, tentative, as if afraid of waking him. As if trying to help without disturbing. Then Henry stepped back. And Fletcher saw him clearly. The boy stood there in just his thin long-sleeved shirt, dark blue and slightly too small, the cuffs riding up his thin wrists. He was shivering. Not dramatically, but in that subtle way children did when they were trying to be brave about discomfort. His breath came out in small clouds in the air. The fire warmed the room, but only near the hearth, and the far corner where the twins sat was notably cooler. Henry had given up his only jacket. His only protection against the chill. For a stranger. For a sleeping old man who had everything. Fletcher's brain scrambled to reinterpret what had just happened. It had to be a distraction tactic. Yes. That must be it. The boy was creating a diversion so his brother could steal the money. It was clever, actually. Almost sophisticated for an 8-year-old. He'd lay the coat over Fletcher, and while Fletcher's attention was on that unexpected gesture, the other twin, Oliver, would grab the envelope. Fletcher waited for the second set of footsteps. For the rustle of paper. For the confirmation that his cynicism was justified. But Henry didn't signal his brother. He didn't glance at the money. He didn't even look at the envelope sitting there, bulging and obvious on the side table just 3 feet away. He simply returned toward his corner, arms wrapped around himself against the cold, and sat back down next to Oliver. Fletcher lay there, frozen in his performance of sleep, the thin red jacket resting on his chest like a weight far heavier than its physical mass. The warmth of it, not just the fabric but the gesture itself, felt like an accusation. His worldview trembled. No, he told himself firmly. There's an explanation. There has to be. This is still a test. People don't just, children don't just. The coat stayed where Henry had placed it. And Fletcher's heart, that organ he thought had calcified years ago, beat faster than it had in decades. Oliver had been watching his brother with wide eyes, impressed by Henry's bravery but also worried. Henry was shivering now, arms wrapped tight around his thin frame. Oliver wanted to give him something too, but he only had his yellow gloves, and those wouldn't help much. Then he noticed 2 things that made him bite his lower lip in concern. First, the envelope of money on the table next to the sleeping man was perched precariously close to the edge. Its corner dangled over empty air, and with every slight vibration in the room, every footstep, every crackle of the fire, it shifted a fraction of an inch closer to falling. If it fell, it would scatter everywhere. The old man might wake up. Mommy would come back and see the mess and think they'd caused trouble. Second, the man's feet were at an awkward angle, twisted slightly to one side where they rested on the floor. Grandpa David used to sit like that sometimes, before he died, and he'd always complained about his legs going numb. Oliver stood up carefully, making sure his movements were slow and deliberate. He couldn't let anything go wrong. Couldn't let Mommy lose this job. Fletcher felt his body go rigid beneath the thin red coat. Here it comes. The second twin approaching. This one would be the thief while the first one was the distraction. It was a classic 2-person con, and he'd been momentarily fooled by a child's manipulative gesture with a coat. Oliver's footsteps approached the table. Fletcher's fingers curled slightly, ready to grab the boy's wrist the moment he touched the money. But Oliver's small hand moved past the cash entirely. Through his barely open eyelids, Fletcher watched in stunned silence as the boy carefully pushed the envelope back from the table's edge, pressing it flat against the center of the mahogany surface. Oliver even straightened it, making sure it was secure, that it wouldn't fall. Then the boy turned away from the money completely. Oliver scanned the room with the focused intensity of a child on a mission. His gaze landed on a small needlepoint footstool near the window, tucked partially behind a potted plant. It was an antique piece that Fletcher's first wife had insisted on buying, worth perhaps $3,000, not that the child would know that. Oliver walked to the window, picked up the footstool with both hands, and carried it back across the room. His steps were measured, careful not to bump into anything. He set the footstool down near Fletcher's feet with barely a sound. Then, with a gentleness that seemed impossible for an 8-year-old boy, Oliver lifted Fletcher's ankles, one hand under each leg, his yellow gloves bright against the dark fabric of Fletcher's expensive trousers, and carefully positioned them on the footstool. The relief was immediate. Fletcher hadn't even realized how uncomfortable his position had been until it was corrected. Blood flow improved. The dull ache in his lower back eased slightly. Oliver stepped back, examining his work with a critical eye, then nodded to himself. He turned toward his brother and whispered, so quietly that Fletcher almost missed it. "Grandpa used to sit like that. Said it helped his legs?" Henry whispered back. "You think the old man's legs hurt too?" "Probably. He's really old." The twins returned to their corner and sat back down in their original positions, backpacks clutched to their chests. Henry was still shivering without his coat, but he didn't complain. Oliver sat close to him, as if trying to share body heat. Silence settled over the room again. Fletcher lay there, frozen in more ways than one. The footstool supported his ankles. The thin coat warmed his chest. The envelope of money sat untouched, secured and safe. He had set a trap for thieves and caught, what? Saints? Idiots? Children too naive to understand opportunity? Or something else entirely that his decades of cynicism had no framework to comprehend? His certainty, that bedrock conviction about human nature, was crumbling like sand. The soft rattle of the cleaning cart announced Adele's return before she even opened the door. Fletcher had exactly 3 seconds to prepare himself. 3 seconds to decide how to proceed with a test that had already gone catastrophically off script. The door swung open. Adele pushed the cart inside, her eyes immediately scanning the room for her sons, still sitting in the corner, still perfectly behaved, before landing on Fletcher himself. Her face drained of all color. She saw Henry's red jacket draped across Fletcher's chest. She saw the envelope of money, moved from its precarious position. She saw the footstool that hadn't been there before, now supporting Fletcher's ankles. Her mouth opened in silent horror. "Mr. Fletcher, sir." She rushed forward, abandoning the cart, her hands already reaching to remove the jacket. "I'm so sorry, sir, they weren't supposed to. They weren't supposed to touch anything, I told them." Fletcher woke, with a theatrical start, blinking as if confused by his surroundings. He looked down at the jacket on his chest, at the footstool beneath his feet, then slowly, deliberately, turned his gaze toward the twins in the corner. His face darkened with calculated anger. "What is this?" His voice was cold, sharp enough to cut. He stood abruptly, the red jacket falling to the floor. He pointed a trembling finger at the Persian rug beneath the twins' feet. "What have they done?" Adele followed his gaze, squinting at the floor. I don't see." "There!" Fletcher's finger jabbed toward 2 barely visible spots on the rug's intricate pattern. Damp marks, no larger than quarters, where the twins' shoes had rested. "Do you know what this rug costs, Mrs. Newton? Do you have any concept?" "Sir, those are they're barely visible, they'll dry." $15,000. Fletcher interrupted, his voice rising. "Hand-woven silk from Isfahan. Took 14 months to create. And your children have destroyed it with their filthy wet shoes." Adele's breath caught. "Destroyed? Mr. Fletcher, please, it's just a little dampness, it will dry completely. The stain will set." Fletcher moved closer, looming over her. "Water damage on antique silk is permanent. Professional restoration costs $800 minimum. I want payment. Now." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. I don't have $800. Adele's voice cracked. "I can't." "Then you're fired. All of you. I'm calling the police for property destruction." "No!" The word tore from Adele's throat. The twins scrambled to their feet, terror written across their faces. Henry's lips were trembling. Oliver looked like he might cry. "Please, Mr. Fletcher, please." Adele's hands clasped together. "I'll work without salary. 3 months. I'll work for free for 3 months to pay for the damage. Please don't fire us. Please don't call the police." 3 months? Fletcher scoffed. "That doesn't even cover half the restoration cost. And I'm supposed to keep incompetent staff out of charity? I'll do anything. I'll work 6 months. A year. Whatever you want." Tears streamed down Adele's face now. "Please! We have nowhere else to go. My boys need. I don't care what your boys need. Fletcher crossed his arms. I care about my property being respected. Clearly, that's too much to ask. He watched Adele collapse into herself, watched the hope drain from her eyes, watched her sons clutch each other in the corner. Henry had started crying silently, his thin shoulders shaking. Oliver stared at Fletcher with something that looked like betrayal, as if the old man had personally broken a promise. Good, Fletcher thought, even as something uncomfortable twisted in his chest. Let them learn early. Let them understand that the world doesn't care about kindness or good intentions. Only money. Only value. Only. The lie tasted bitter, even in his own mind. Henry stepped forward. His legs were shaking so badly Fletcher could see his knees knocking together beneath his worn jeans, but the boy's voice, though trembling, carried a resolve that stopped everyone in the room. Sir, I don't have $800. Fletcher's prepared response died on his lips as Henry reached for his backpack with hands that wouldn't quite stay steady. The zipper caught, and the boy had to try twice before getting it open. But I have this. From the backpack, Henry pulled a baseball glove. It was old, the leather cracked and faded to a mottled brown, the stitching loose in several places, the padding compressed from years of use. The webbing sagged. One of the finger stalls had been repaired with electrical tape. Henry held it out with both hands, like an offering at an altar. It was my dad's. He died 2 years ago. The boy's voice cracked on the word died, but he pushed forward. This is from when he played minor league baseball. Before he met Mommy. It's real leather. You could sell it. It's worth something. Fletcher took the glove automatically, his fingers closing around the worn leather before his brain could process what was happening. The glove was warm from being pressed against Henry's back in the backpack. It smelled faintly of old leather and something else, sweat, maybe, or just the accumulated scent of countless games of catch. He turned it over in his hands. The glove was nearly worthless in monetary terms. $20 at a pawn shop, maybe. Probably less. The leather was too damaged, the brand too obscure, the condition too poor. But Henry's fingerprints were worn into the leather from hours of use. The boy had held this glove so many times, in exactly the same way, that his grip had left permanent impressions. The leather was darker where small hands had gripped it, lighter where they hadn't. This was a glove that had been loved, treasured, used until it was nearly falling apart. Wait! Oliver stepped forward too, his voice barely above a whisper. He dug into the pocket of his pants and pulled out a dented harmonica. The metal was tarnished, one of the covers slightly bent. This too. Dad played it every night before bed. He knew 5 songs. It's silver. Maybe that's worth money? It wasn't silver. Fletcher could tell that immediately. It was cheap chrome-plated brass, worth maybe $5 new. Now, dented and tarnished? Maybe $1. Maybe nothing. He held both items now. The glove in his left hand. The harmonica in his right. Together, they might fetch $25 if he found the most generous buyer in the world. And these boys were offering them to save their mother from a crime Fletcher had invented. They were giving up their only connections to their dead father. The most precious things they owned. Their inheritance. Their memories made tangible. Fletcher's hands began to tremble. Not the theatrical trembling of manufactured anger, but real shaking that he couldn't control. The glove felt impossibly heavy in his palm. The harmonica burned against his skin like it was on fire instead of cold metal. He looked at Henry's face, streaked with tears but set with determination. He looked at Oliver, who was trying so hard not to cry that his whole body had gone rigid. He looked at Adele, who had collapsed to her knees, her hands pressed to her mouth. These children were richer than he could ever be. They knew what mattered. They understood value in a way his billions had never taught him. And he had forgotten entirely. 73 years of accumulated wisdom suddenly felt like 73 years of accumulated stupidity. Fletcher's carefully maintained composure shattered like glass. The tears came first, hot and unexpected, running down his weathered face in tracks he couldn't control. He hadn't cried in decades. Not at his father's funeral. Not during any of his divorces. Not when Marcus had betrayed him. But now, holding a worthless baseball glove and a dented harmonica, Benjamin Fletcher wept like a child. I wasn't asleep. His voice cracked on every syllable. I was testing you. I put that money there deliberately, $5,000, positioned carelessly, like bait in a trap. To see if you'd steal. Adele's sharp intake of breath cut through the room, but Fletcher kept talking, the words pouring out like poison he'd been holding in for years. Everyone steals. Everyone I've ever trusted has stolen from me. My wives took my money and my dignity. My children forged my signature and disappeared until they needed more. My business partner embezzled millions while shaking my hand every morning. My staff, butlers, cooks, housekeepers, they all took something. Cash. Jewelry. Silver. Trust. He looked at Henry, still shivering without his coat. I thought you would too. I thought you'd see that money and take it. Because that's what people do. That's what I've learned in 73 years of living. Given the chance, everyone steals. Fletcher bent down and picked up Henry's red jacket from where it had fallen. He held it like it was made of gold. But you didn't steal. You gave. His voice broke completely. You gave me warmth when you were cold. You protected my money from falling when you could have taken it. You cared for an old man who has shown you nothing but coldness and cruelty. He turned to Oliver. You saw me uncomfortable and you helped. You moved furniture to ease my pain. You noticed things I didn't think children could notice. You saw a person, not a test subject. Fletcher's hands trembled as he held out the baseball glove and harmonica, offering them back to the boys. Your father raised remarkable sons. He taught you something I never learned, something I forgot existed. And I've been a fool. A bitter, lonely fool. Henry took the glove carefully, clutching it to his chest. Oliver pocketed the harmonica with shaking hands. Fletcher turned to Adele, who was still kneeling on the floor, confusion and relief warring across her tear-stained face. He pulled the envelope from the table, the bait, the trap, the test, and held it out to her. This is yours. A bonus. Your boys taught me something today that 73 years couldn't. Kindness isn't a fairy tale. It's real. And I'd forgotten what real looked like. Adele stared at the money like it might bite her. Mr. Fletcher, I can't. You can. You will. He pressed it into her hands, then turned to the twins. His voice steadied, becoming clearer, more certain than it had been in years. And I want to hire you both. Come here after school every day. Not to clean or work, to teach me. Teach me what you know. How to care. How to be kind. How to see people instead of potential betrayals. The twins exchanged glances, their silent communication as clear as spoken words. In exchange, Fletcher continued, I'll pay for your education. Elementary school, high school, college, graduate school if you want it. Everything. Books, tuition, room and board. Whatever you need. Deal? Henry looked at Oliver. Oliver looked at Henry. Then, slowly, both boys nodded. Deal, Henry whispered. Deal, Oliver echoed. Benjamin Fletcher died at 85, peacefully, in the same leather chair where he'd once pretended to sleep while hunting for proof of human betrayal. His hands rested on a photo album open to a picture of two young men in graduation caps and gowns, their arms around each other, their smiles so bright they seemed to illuminate the frame. The study had changed over the 12 years since that rainy November afternoon. Children's artwork now hung alongside the original Monet, crayon drawings of stick figures holding hands, watercolor paintings of sunsets, handprint turkeys from elementary school Thanksgivings. Henry's red jacket, preserved and pristine, sat in a shadow box on the wall like a museum piece. Fletcher's own later attempts at woodworking, a crooked birdhouse, a lopsided bookend, a picture frame with uneven corners, were displayed with the same pride as his business awards. The room felt lived in. Loved. Warm. The biological children arrived for the will reading with their lawyers. Daniel, now 46 and graying. Emma, 42 and dressed in designer black. They sat stiffly in chairs they'd rarely occupied during Fletcher's life, their faces carefully neutral masks of appropriate grief. Henry and Oliver Newton, now 20 years old and home from college, sat together on the couch. They weren't wearing suits, just clean jeans and button-down shirts, the same way they'd dressed for 12 years of after-school visits. Oliver still wore yellow gloves sometimes, when he needed courage. Henry still carried his father's baseball glove in his backpack, though it was now professionally restored, the leather supple and dark. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading. Daniel and Emma would receive their trust funds, established years ago, $5 million each, enough to live comfortably but not extravagantly. The house in Vermont would go to charity. The art collection would be auctioned, proceeds to various foundations. And everything else, the business holdings, the real estate portfolio, the investment accounts, the stocks, the bonds, the entirety of Fletcher's liquid assets, would go to Henry and Oliver Newton. $840 million. Emma's sharp intake of breath cut through the silence. Daniel's face went red then white. This is insane. Those kids, he knew them for 12 years. We're his children. His blood. The lawyer held up a hand and continued reading Fletcher's letter, written in the shaking handwriting of his final weeks. To Henry and Oliver, you gave me a coat when I had everything and you had nothing. You gave me a footstool when I'd forgotten what care looked like. I give you an empire. But you've already taught me the empire means nothing compared to what you gave me that day. You restored something I thought I'd lost forever, not my faith in humanity, but something deeper. My soul. My ability to see goodness. My capacity to believe that kindness exists without ulterior motive. Use this money to be the men your father raised you to be. I died rich because you reminded me what wealth actually means. It means having people who care when you're cold. It means noticing when someone needs help. It means giving everything you have, even when you have almost nothing. Especially then. The lawyer reached into a box and pulled out 2 items. David Newton's baseball glove, professionally refurbished until it looked brand new while somehow maintaining every crease and mark that Henry's hands had made. And David Newton's harmonica, engraved now with both boys' names and polished until it gleamed. 20 years later, the Newton Foundation would help thousands of families escape poverty. The Newton Scholarship Fund would send 10,000 children to college. And 2 middle-aged men would still visit Fletcher's grave every November, carrying a red jacket and a footstool, remembering the day they taught a billionaire what it meant to be rich. The best investments don't yield money, they yield meaning. And kindness compounds across generations in ways no stock market can measure. If you enjoy this story, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching.